Alright, Site 27, Campaign Diary. Started the second mission this past weekend. Didn't have the full player group. The Ranger was missing this time. He had to miss this session, which, excuse me, took care of narratively, easy enough. As soon as I start recording, I got a burp. I don't know. Anyway, so they get the party gets some information that their next mission is going to be, they have to investigate this town, mostly the town, but the surrounding county. There's tons and tons of disappearances, and disappearances isn't necessarily the type of thing that the Foundation gets involved in, but there's so many disappearances that have ramped up so quickly, it's probably a bit weird. Initially, the Foundation suspects a previously undiscovered 939 infestation, but when they send some agents in to investigate, these agents don't find anything, especially at this very large cave system, relatively close to the town in question. They find nothing. Then when the agents report in that, hey, they didn't find anything, we're going to the town, the agents disappear after that, never report in again. So it's the players' objective to investigate this town. They will start the mission about a mile outside of town, so they have to walk into town through the forest, because it's a heavily forested, like, woodland area. Right beforehand, I introduced them to a new NPC, Agent Edward Graham, their communications officer, dude, guy, that guy, and communications dude. So that, and he gives them some fancy new headsets that use like anomalous quantum technology to be able to communicate instantaneously over long distances with somewhat limited battery reserves, and you only activate it once you're on site, blah, blah, blah. But you can essentially only talk to the operator with it. It's not hooked into some larger network. Presumably because these things have to be made in a quantum entangled way, so that you can't just like add a new one or plug it into a network. It doesn't quite work that way. Not worried about it too much. It's just communication, so that they have an NPC they can talk to. And this guy is relatively knowledgeable, because I know the players don't know the SCP Wiki as well as I do. I've been reading it for like 10 years at this point. So what do you like? They don't know it as well, so they can, if they have questions, they can ask this dude. But so they get on their mission, and they're going through the forest. Some creepy stuff, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But they find some creepy stuff. They find a stripped deer carcass, like lots of bones are crushed and deep gashes all over the skeleton. Crushed in skull. Weirdness. They keep going, and then they find they keep going for a little bit, and over in the distance, they see a single deer that looks to be injured, limping along. And they're all cautious at this point, at least a little bit. One of the players is already starting to have one of the characters is already starting to have like a mini panic attack. And then, as this deer moves forward, it collapses after a while and then stares backward in an agitated state. Nobody insight checked the deer, but, I mean, it looks agitated. And they see 3 very large raccoons. Not like anomalously large, just like raccoons can get like 40 pounds. They can get big, like the size of an ottoman. the thing you rest your feet on in a chair. They can get as big as some of those. And these raccoons are running straight for the deer. Their mouths are hanging open. Their tongues are flying in the wind. And their eyes are darting all over the place. They're not even looking at the deer that they're chasing after. So that's a little unsettling. Two of the players notice this and they act appropriately. They get the panicking character's attention, and he looks over and he just screams. Okay, the raccoon that's like closest to them in this like little parade of 3 raccoons, that one changes trajectory and he starts running towards the players. So they take this, they all get ready. The one player that's out front and he previously drew his gun. He takes a shot at some of these raccoons, but as he does, these raccoons jump into the air and they open up. The whole front of their body opens up into 6 equally sized appendages, like mandibles, jaw structures covered in pointed, hooked teeth. And in the middle of it is a flailing tongue ending in a vicious barb. So, a little more unsettling. A fight ensues. And I'll talk about these in a minute after the recap. A fight ensues that only 2 of the players actually take any kind of damage. One of the players utilizes his new cover generating shield to hold them off a little bit, and that thing is going to be more useful later on in this adventure. But they manage to kill these things and they get some information off of it. And the one researcher starts to do some tests on it. They fail some religion type checks to really identify what's going on. They talk to their communications contact. He gives them some extra things to test for. They do. Comes back after a while, and it through contacting him again, reveals the presence of this one protein that reveals that this is probably a sarkic transformation. And I was toying with the idea of not revealing this information at first, like letting the players kind of figure it out. But it would make sense that this Graham character would kind of suspect these things. So it was there if the players failed knowledge checks to really understand it. So that's a thing. I was toying with the idea of not revealing it right away, but that's another key point of horror and stuff like that I'm finding that again I'll get into after the recap. But they find out it's probably sarkic in nature, so they keep going forward. And basically this whole session is them going through the forest. It was a little shorter. It was like under 4 hours, like 3.5 or so. We started a little late, but then after a while they're stealthing through the forest. Everything that was watching them or could perceive them failed a lot of their perception checks, so they just kind of got through. Good for them, I guess. And they found a 3rd deer carcass. Now this deer carcass is very fresh, but up to this point they were suspecting that only like predatory animals were being affected by whatever was affecting the area. But this deer is obviously transformed as well. It has massive hindquarters. It's thick, like just giant back legs, and enormous antlers. And after they investigated, they find that most likely these antlers grew from the head of this creature incredibly quickly, splitting open the skin. And this deer also seems to have a broken neck. These antlers grew so suddenly and they're so heavy that they broke the deer's neck in the process. So these transformations are a little bit chaotic. They're not guided, potentially. They get some information there. More unsettling. And they get to the town. Oh, guess what? It's empty. There's nothing around. There's nobody here. Tons of buildings. And they make some perception checks, and then in a close, because it's so quiet, a close building, they can hear some water running. And then a building like a little farther away, they can hear some clattering. You know, it's like seemingly inside the house, but they can't discern exactly what it is. And then session ended there. So, using this as a kind of staging or as an example, we're going to talk about, I guess, my DM style and horror in general, especially in a game like this. Because horror in things like movies and books and what I'm going to call non-interactive media is pretty straightforward. Like, all you really have to do to build horror, and I am grossly oversimplifying this. It's of course an art, just like anything with media. But all you really have to do at the basic level is get the characters, or get the audience to care about like the characters, and then portray something threatening and overwhelmingly threatening, potentially, that the characters have no hope against. You know, again, gross oversimplification, but that's all you really have to do. Hopelessness, other like overwhelming malice on the antagonistic forces part, though, like, those are all good and more qualifiers. But that's the basis of all you have to do. If you want to, that's to inflict like just straight horror. If you want to inflict dread, other similar related emotions, you have to do some other things. Which, something the SCP Wiki is good at is dread, which is like kind of a mix of horror with wonder. I guess maybe that's not quite dread, but because it's like usually when you read an article, a big part of the horror is like enough stuff is left out that it gets you wondering. You have questions that there are answers for, but you can't find them. All you can do is speculate, and that's part of the fun of this type of horror. And a big example on the SCP Wiki of how to do this right and wrong is like redactions. Redactions have fallen out of favor for a while. They still pop up from time to time. But one of the main points about redactions is if you're going to use redactions, make sure you know what's actually in there. Like, I mean, if it's a date or a place, that's not as important. Like, it's just a town somewhere. That's irrelevant information. It doesn't matter that much. Like, you don't gain a whole lot by knowing exactly what town it is. Unless the town is important. Then, if the town is in some way important to the narrative, like, if there's an SCP involving, like, the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth Rock or fucking wherever, or Roanoke, or, all these things that there's some previous history about, or some additional information you can connect outside of the article just by knowing the name of the town, then sure, then it's important. And maybe you can provide context clues, and maybe the reader can figure out what the town is, even though it's redacted. But if it's not important, it can be redacted or not redacted, and it doesn't change the article. But for a lot of other information, say, like, something that's a good redaction is 096. The shy guy. When he catches up to somebody that's seen his face, he does data expunged to them, or maybe it was redacted. It's a semantic difference, but it can matter. This creature does something to the individuals it catches. you can infer from context clues it like consumes them, but it doesn't actually state this. Just that it opens its mouth, something happens, and that previous individual is gone. You can infer that it eats them. But the author of that article obviously knows what happens. And there's context clues that you can just kind of guess that it's eating them. But that is also the kind of redaction that builds the horror a little bit. Like, yeah, it's probably eating them, but maybe he does it, this entity, I keep saying he, it's a walking skeleton man. But like the way it's written, and because it's redacted, maybe this creature does it in such a horrific way that it is redacted, or maybe it's a cognitohazardous effect understanding what it does to these people, something like that. But point is, a big part of horror is redacting or not giving certain pieces of information, so that in this case the audience is wondering. So how does this apply to like a D&D game? Or actually, to touch really quick on that subject, in like slasher movies, which is kind of what I would consider like a lower form. It's horror adjacent, but it's not really horror. It's a thriller slasher. It's a separate kind of thing. It's just horror adjacent. But it still builds horror in certain ways by like usually the antagonistic force. You know, like Michael Myers, like why he can do the things that he does. I haven't watched all the movies, so this is probably explained in like Halloween 13, Electric Boogaloo. That like exactly what Michael Myers is, but by not explaining it, the audience is forced to fill in the gaps or deal with this complete lack of information. And that can make things even more horrifying. Like, look at the Aliens franchise. This is a horror thriller that is much, much closer to horror itself. That does a fantastic job. It shows enough of the monster that you know it's real, and you start to get an idea of what it's doing. You get some really, really direct shots of it, and every time it like kills people, it does it so efficiently and quickly that it's presented as such a powerful creature. It's so overwhelming, and it's so hopeless for the main characters to possibly be able to fight it in a fair way that they have to figure something out. And also its origins are completely unexplained. Like they just find an alien ship, there's a dead alien in it, and there's a bunch of eggs. Okay. Easy. That's such an effective way to build horror, the lack of information. So how does this apply to something like a D&D game? Well, in a D&D game or in a video game, horror works a little differently, because it can be harder for a player to feel fully invested in their character, and especially their character's death, partially because when you die, you just respawn. Like, you're not going to lose anything. And it can be difficult to try to enforce that, because, like, say, if there were, like, you can envision, like, a horror roguelike game that's really difficult to get through. And when you die, you lose all your progress. I assume these have already been made. I just don't have the examples. But, because if it's set up in such a way that every time you die, you have to